Okay, let's unpack this. Be honest with yourself for a moment. When you hear the word grammar, what pops into your head? Is it maybe the dusty textbooks? The endless exercises identifying nouns and verbs, perhaps diagramming sentences until your eyes glazed over?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, that's probably it.
If your experience of grammar comes primarily from school, chances are it evokes a feeling that ranges from, well, mild annoyance to outright boredom, and you are absolutely not alone in that.
It's a very common reaction, isn't it? Grammar was often presented as this rigid set of rules you had to memorize and follow, a kind of linguistic etiquette.
Right.
That felt disconnected from the living, breathing language we use every day.
Exactly. It felt like something imposed on language rather than something that is language.
Right.
But what if that whole picture was completely wrong? What if grammar, the actual underlying structure of what we say and write, is far more complex, more dynamic, and frankly, much more fascinating and surprising than any school lesson ever let on?
That's the real question, isn't it?
That's the journey we're taking today. We're diving deep into a single, incredibly rich source. The book titled simply Grammar by F.R. Palmer.
Ah, Palmer.
Yeah.
Good choice.
We're looking at the second edition, originally published back in 1971, but still packed with insights that really challenge our assumptions.
And Palmer's a fantastic guide for this exploration.
Yeah.
He was a distinguished lecturer and professor of linguistics, known for his pioneering research, particularly on African languages.
Right. I saw that, like Ethiopian languages.
Exactly. Tigrinya, Tigray, Bilin, Aga, which exposed him to incredible structural diversity. He lectured widely across the globe and was recognized as a Fellow of the British Academy for his contributions.
So he really understood grammar not as some static rule book.
Not at all, but as the intricate, often hidden system that underpins human communication.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack the core arguments and insights from Palmer's book, specifically those that challenge the common, often prescriptive views of grammar you might have encountered.
The school grammar view.
Yeah. We want to explore how linguists like Palmer have gone about trying to understand the actual hidden structure of the language you use every single day, the language that lets you understand me right now and lets you formulate your own thoughts and responses. Let's peel back those layers.
Let's. And Palmer's book wastes no time in getting to the heart of the matter, starting with a nod to that very feeling of grammar being a struggle for mastery.
Right. He opens the book referencing that classic scene from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Humpty Dumpty is holding forth on the meaning of words.
Ah, Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean.
Neither more nor less, yeah.
And Alice, bless her heart, questions this, saying, the question is whether you can make words mean so many different things.
And Humpty's reply.
To which Humpty Dumpty replies, the question is, which is to be master, that's all. And he adds that verbs are the proudest, while adjectives are humble and you can do anything with them.
It's a perfect literary starting point because it captures the essence of the prescriptive view, the idea that grammar is about controlling language, about making language bend to our will or to a set of predetermined rules.
Exactly.
And the source points out that Alice herself, living in Victorian times, would almost certainly have been taught grammar in school. And it's highly probable she was just as bored by it as generations of students since.
Absolutely. And as Palmer notes, this feeling of grammar being a dry, tedious subject led, in some places, to the traditional teaching of it being significantly reduced or even dropped from school curricula entirely.
Which has consequences.
Right. So, unlike Alice, many people today might not even learn the traditional definitions for something as basic as the difference between an adjective and a verb, or the components of a sentence. This sets up the central tension Palmer explores, the vast gulf between the dry, rule-focused school subject and the rich, complex, and dynamic field of linguistic study.
Precisely. And much of the confusion, as the source highlights immediately, stems from the term grammar itself, which is used in several different, often misleading ways in everyday conversation. Palmer calls these misconceptions.
Okay, so the first misconception Palmer tackles is that grammar is simply a physical object, a book.
A book, yeah.
People ask to borrow a grammar, meaning a copy of a grammar book.
And the danger here is, well, it's more profound than it seems. If you equate grammar with the book, you can fall into the trap of thinking the book is the grammar, that it creates or dictates the language.
Right, that the book defines it.
But from a linguistic perspective, that's fundamentally backward. The grammar of a language exists independently in the minds and speech of its speakers. A grammar book is merely an attempt to describe that existing system.
He uses an analogy, doesn't he?
Palmer uses a brilliant analogy here. Writing a grammar book is like writing a book about biology. Biology exists whether a textbook is written about it or not. The textbook describes the living world. Similarly, language has structure and rules, whether or not a grammarian writes them down. The description is not the thing itself.
That analogy really clarifies the difference between prescription and description. Grammar isn't invented by grammarians. It's discovered and described, like gravity or photosynthesis. Okay, misconception number 2. Grammar exists only in written language.
This is a deeply ingrained belief for many people, partly because the very word grammar comes from the Greek grammatic techne, meaning the art of writing.
Ah, the etymology.
That's the historical root of our term grammar school, places where the written language and classical texts were central. However, from a descriptive linguistic point of view, this is simply false. Spoken languages, all spoken languages, have grammar.
Even languages that have no written form at all. The source points out there are hundreds of such languages spoken around the world.
Absolutely. If grammar were exclusive to writing, then a language spoken by a non-literate community would absurdly be considered grammarless. This is unthinkable to a linguist.
It just doesn't make sense.
While there are certainly differences between speech and writing tends to be more conservative and homogeneous, changing slower than speech, which is constantly evolving, and varies more across different speakers and dialects.
Sure.
This doesn't mean grammar is only present or primarily located in the written form. Spoken language is the primary form of human language. Writing is a secondary representation.
That's a crucial point. So the structure is inherent in the spoken language, regardless of whether it's ever written down. Misconception number 3 is related, but focuses on which languages have grammar. The idea that some languages have a lot of it, maybe too much, while others, like English or Chinese, have precious little, as Palmer quotes.
What people typically mean here, Palmer explains, is the relative lack of inflections, which falls under the domain of morphology. Morphology is the study of the internal structure of words and how their forms change to reflect grammatical function. They compare English or Chinese to languages like Latin, which has a very rich inflectional system. A single Latin verb, like amo, meaning I love, can take over 100 different forms.
100 forms. Wow.
To indicate who is doing the loving, who is being loved, when it happened, the mood, the voice, and so on.
Right, and compare that to the English verb to love. We have love, loves, loved, and loving. Maybe you count the irregular past tense took versus present take as another example.
Maybe 5 forms, tops, for most verbs, like take.
Bringing the total for many English verbs to perhaps 5 forms. And as Palmer notes, words in languages like Chinese often remain the same shape regardless of their grammatical role in the sentence.
Precisely. So when someone says English has little grammar, they mean it has relatively little morphology. But this view is far too narrow because it completely overlooks syntax. Which syntax is the other major component of grammar, concerned with how words are combined in order to form phrases, clauses, and sentences. And while English might be less inflectional than Latin, its syntax is incredibly important and complex.
Word order matters a lot.
Absolutely. Palmer gives the classic example. John saw Bill means something fundamentally different from Bill saw John. The meaning is determined almost entirely by the order of the words, not their form. Similarly, the order matters in phrases like steel sheet versus sheet steel. That's syntax at work.
So from a linguist's perspective, grammar isn't just morphology, and it's certainly not just prescriptive rules found in a book. It's the entire system of structure, morphology, and syntax that speakers intuitively know and use.
It describes what people do when they speak, not what someone thinks they should do.
Got it.
And within the broader field of linguistics, grammar is seen as one level of analysis, typically distinguished from phonology, the study of the sound system, and semantics, the study of meaning.
Palmer describes it as sitting in the middle, having a Janus-like relation like the Roman god with the 2 faces looking both ways.
Connecting to both sound and meaning.
Yeah, connecting to both sound and meaning.
Yes. The sound of a word matters for its form, morphology, and the structure, grammar, is crucial for conveying meaning, semantics. For instance, the plural ending in English depends on the final sound of the noun, phonology.
Right, like cats versus dogs.
And the subject-verb structure is essential for indicating who is doing what, semantics. Although, as Palmer acknowledges, the precise boundaries and the status of grammar relative to these other levels of language are areas of ongoing debate within linguistics.
Okay, so if grammar, in the linguistic sense, is about describing the inherent structure of language and not about prescriptive rules, where do all those rules we learned in school actually come from? Palmer tackles this head-on, challenging the traditional prescriptive approach.
And he points out that a significant source for many of these traditional English rules is, perhaps surprisingly, Latin.
Latin?
Right.
Really?
Historically, Latin was considered the most prestigious language, the model of logic and structure.
This created a rather circular situation, as Palmer notes. Learning Latin was supposed to help you understand English grammar, but often that was only true because the way English grammar was taught in the first place was based on the structure of Latin.
It's like using a Latin key.
It was like using a Latin key to unlock an English door that was specifically designed to be opened by that Latin key.
Exactly. A classic example is the rule insisting on "it is I" instead of the commonly used "it is me."
Yes, the eternal debate.
The traditional argument is based on Latin case. In Latin, pronouns agreeing with the subject through the verb to be, the copula, would be in the nominative case, just like the subject.
Okay.
Since it is the subject in the nominative, I, also nominative, is considered the grammatically correct form because it's in apposition to the subject and should match its case.
And Palmer's critique of the reasoning often used to justify this in English is quite sharp. He calls the idea that I must be in the nominative because it's identical with it's utterly implausible.
Yeah, he pushes back hard on that.
He asks, by that logic, is myself in I washed myself also in the nominative case? The supposed logical equivalence used for it is I doesn't apply elsewhere.
It falls apart pretty quickly. The real reason, Palmer argues, is simply because it's following a rule borrowed directly from Latin.
Okay, that makes more sense. Another example.
He is bigger than I versus he is bigger than me.
Another classic.
The justification often given is that than must be a conjunction, not a preposition, and the sentence is an elliptical or a shortened form of he is bigger than I am, with am being understood.
Right, the understood verb.
Since I is the subject of the understood clause I am, it must be in the nominative case.
But Palmer shows this logic doesn't hold consistently. If than must always be a conjunction, what about after? We can say, he came after I left, where after is a conjunction.
Yeah.
But we can also say, he came after me, where after is clearly a preposition. Why shouldn't then function similarly to after in English?
Exactly. Palmer points out that in Latin, quam than was always a conjunction, whereas post after could be a preposition or post quam a conjunction.
Ah, so they just picked the Latin rule for then.
The English grammarians, using Latin as their model, imposed the Latin rule that than is always a conjunction onto English, arbitrarily ignoring the parallel behavior of words like after.
So in actual English usage...
Palmer's observation is that in actual English usage, than behaves like after. It can be either a conjunction or a preposition. Thus, both then I and then me are valid in English, depending on the structure employed.
Okay.
And the insistence on only then I comes from an ill-fitting rule borrowed from Latin.
So a significant portion of the prescriptive rules we learn aren't based on some universal logic of language or even logic inherent to English, but on trying to make English behave like Latin.
Precisely. And beyond Latin, Palmer discusses rules based on flawed attempts at logic that aren't truly linguistic. These often serve to support rules that might have originally come from Latin anyway.
Like double negatives.
The most frequently cited example is the prohibition against double negatives, as in, I didn't see nobody, or I didn't go nowhere.
The logic here is usually framed in mathematical terms. Two negatives make a positive, like -2 times -2 equals +4.
Right.
So I didn't see nobody must logically mean I saw somebody.
And Palmer's response is direct. This is nonsense.
Oh, okay.
Why, from a linguistic perspective, should two negatives cancel rather than reinforce each other? He points to historical and comparative evidence. Double negatives were common and perfectly acceptable in older forms of English, including in the works of Shakespeare.
Right, I've heard that.
And they are standard grammatical features of many other languages. In Spanish, you might say no dije nada, which literally translates to not, I said nothing.
Nothing, yeah.
In Russian, nikto ne rabotal is literally nobody not worked. In both cases, the multiple negatives emphasize the negation. Classical Greek also used double negatives extensively, while Latin generally avoided them.
Which brings us back to the Latin influence. if the prescriptive grammarians had used Greek as their model instead of Latin?
They might have insisted English must use double negatives for stronger negation. Absolutely. There is no inherent logical reason within language structure itself to condemn double negatives.
But there's a social aspect too, right?
Exactly. Palmer adds a crucial caveat. Proving a rule isn't logically justified doesn't automatically make the forms it forbids good English, if by good you mean the forms used by educated people. The rule against double negatives isn't illogical in a formal sense. It's simply not a linguistic rule, but a social one that distinguishes standard English from certain dialects.
That's a key insight. These rules aren't about efficiency or clarity, but about social stratification. Another example of flawed logic concerns the use of singular there with singular antecedents, like someone has left their book behind, or if anybody can come, would they please let me know?
The traditional argument against this is based on the notion that someone, or anybody, is singular, while there and they are plural.
Singular subject, singular pronoun.
The logic dictates that a singular subject must be referred to by a singular pronoun, which, in the absence of gender information, is typically his, according to older rules.
Which is obviously problematic.
Palmer even references the Duchess in Alice in Wonderland using their selves, but the core problem with insisting on his is clear. It fails when the person's sex is unknown, or when you want to be inclusive without specifying gender.
Right. So there has evolved in English to function not just as a plural possessive, but also as a singular possessive when the antecedent is indefinite or gender neutral.
Exactly. Palmer argues that this usage of they, them, and their for singular antecedents of unspecified sex is common, useful, and in no way inherently illogical or ungrammatical. Unless, as he puts it, we decide, contrary to our observations, that they, them, and their are always plural. It's a descriptive observation of how the language is actually used by many speakers, regardless of what a prescriptive rulebook might say.
This brings us squarely to the third source of prescriptive rules, social judgment. This is where forms like they was there, he ain't comin', don't talk to I, or I seed him are labeled ungrammatical.
And Palmer is unequivocal here. He states that these are perfectly possible constructions within certain English dialects.
So why are they wrong?
Why are they deemed ungrammatical or wrong in the standard view? Palmer's blunt answer is, quite simply, they're not standard English. There's no other answer to this question.
Wow, that's a powerful statement because it strips away any pretense of inherent linguistic inferiority. The judgment is purely social. These dialectal forms are not less efficient, less logical, or less clear than their standard English counterparts, like, they were there, he isn't coming, don't talk to me, or I saw him.
Not at all. In fact, Palmer notes that standard English has its own historical shifts, sometimes abandoning older, more irregular forms. For instance, dived has become standard, where some dialects might use the older, stronger past tense dove.
Interesting.
Conversely, some dialects preserve features closer to older forms of English, like the second-person singular pronouns thou. The prevalence of standard forms is a matter of historical accident and social prestige, not absolute grammatical validity.
So they're not better or worse linguistically?
They are no better or no worse linguistically. They are simply different and carry different social weight.
So to sum up this section, many traditional grammar rules stem not from the fundamental nature of English, but from imitating Latin, flawed attempts at logic, and perhaps most significantly, social distinctions between dialects.
It really shifts the focus from obeying rules to understanding the complex factors that shape what we perceive as correct. It encourages a descriptive rather than a judgmental view of language.
All right, leaving behind the prescriptive rules, let's delve into how linguists with a descriptive mindset actually try to understand and map the structure of language itself. And Palmer starts this by looking at the fundamental units, beginning with something that seems obvious but is surprisingly tricky to define: the word.
You'd think this would be simple. Everyone uses words. We see them separated by spaces in writing.
Yeah, seems basic.
But Palmer notes that traditional grammars often start classifying things like nouns and verbs as if the word is an unquestioned basic unit, without ever providing a solid linguistic justification for why it's the basic unit, or even how to define it rigorously.
And here's where a surprising fact comes in, something that highlights how much our idea of language is influenced by writing. Palmer points out that in spoken language, there are no spaces between words.
None at all, really.
Absolutely none. He finds it surprising how many people don't realize this because the visual influence of writing is so strong that we unconsciously project those spaces onto speech. We hear the gaps we see on the page.
Exactly. Experimental phonetics confirms that speech is much more of a continuous stream than discrete units separated by pauses. Significant breaks in speech typically occur at the end of phrases, clauses, or sentences, not reliably between every word.
You notice it with foreign languages.
Palmer suggests you notice this most clearly when listening to a language you don't understand. It often sounds like an undifferentiated flow of sound, making it hard to pick out individual words.
So does the division of language into words, which is so prominent in writing, actually correspond to a linguistically justified unit in speech?
Palmer thinks probably yes, suggesting that children learning language seem to operate with some underlying principles that lead them to identify word-like units.
And linguists studying non-literate societies.
And linguists studying non-literate societies can identify words based on their behavior in sentences, suggesting a kind of institutionalized recognition of these units by the speakers themselves, even without writing.
He also gives a historical perspective. Ancient inscriptions, like those from the Greeks, didn't use spaces between words. They wrote them continuously.
Right, scriptio continua.
Yet even ancient philosophers like Plato discussing the elements of language in works like Cratylus were clearly talking about what we would recognize as words. So the concept of a word predates the use of spaces in writing.
Interesting.
Palmer also mentions Bloomfield's attempt to define the word as a minimum free form, the smallest unit that can occur in isolation.
But even that test has limitations. Can you really use the or a in isolation?
Not really.
And some languages have specific forms used only when a word is isolated. Furthermore, when you're talking about language itself, you can isolate parts that aren't words, like saying S is the plural morpheme. So the test isn't universally applicable.
The conclusion seems to be that while the written word division likely does correspond to a real linguistic unit, defining exactly what constitutes a word in speech or universally across all languages is far from simple and has challenged linguists.
It highlights the difficulty of applying straightforward concepts to the messy reality of language. From the slippery concept of a word, we move to how words are built and structured, which leads us back to morphology.
This is the study of the internal form and structure of words, including how they change their shape through inflections or derivations, like adding suffixes or prefixes.
It's distinct from syntax, which is about how words combine. Palmer touches on the older tradition of classifying languages based on their morphology. Inflectional languages like Latin.
Lots of endings.
Agglutinative languages like Turkish or Swahili, which build words by chaining together many distinct morphemes.
Like Lego blocks?
And isolating languages like Chinese, where words tend to have single, unchanging forms.
But he critiques this classification as not being particularly useful.
He argues that it only focuses on one aspect, word formation, and crucially, most languages aren't purely one type. English, for instance, has elements of all three.
How so?
Prepositions like by function like isolating words. Verbs like seesaw show inflectional characteristics, though not a full paradigm like Latin. And forms like love, loves, loved, loving involve attaching distinct suffixes in a way that could be seen as agglutinative.
So these aren't really types of languages as a whole,
but rather characteristics found to varying degrees in different parts of a language's grammar.
This complexity leads to a deeper area called morphophonemics, the study of the interaction between morphology and phonology. How do the sounds of a language affect the forms of its morphemes?
The classic English example is the plural morpheme, the unit of meaning indicating more than one. While written as S or E, it has different pronunciation.
Right, like S, E's, E's.
After sounds made with your voice box vibrating, voiced sounds, like in dogs, it's pronounced Z. After sounds without vocal cord vibration, voiceless sounds, like in cats, it's S. And after sounds like is, Z, 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 sibilants in affricates, you add a vowel sound before the Z, making it is, as in horses.
So the meaning is the same, plural, but the sound of the ending changes automatically depending on the sound that comes before it.
Exactly. Palmer references Bloomfield's term phonetic alternates, or allomorphs, for these different sound forms, is, Z, of the same morpheme. This variation is phonologically determined. The surrounding sounds dictate the form.
And the past tense E works similarly.
The past tense morpheme works the same way. Pronounce E after T, hated, D after voiced sounds loved, and D after voiceless sounds liked.
But then you have more complex examples like take, took, mean, meant, shoot, shot, where it's not just the ending changing.
But the vowel within the word, sometimes with consonants added or removed. These involve vowel changes and often require more complex explanations than simple phonetic conditioning.
Which led to different ways of describing this.
They led to different theoretical approaches to describing morphology. Palmer introduces the distinction between the item and arrangement IA model, favored by early structuralists, and the item and process IP model, which is more traditional and used in later generative phonology.
What's the difference? How would IA handle knife to knives?
The IA model basically lists the different forms as separate items and describes how they are arranged. We would see knife and knife, as in knives, as alternate forms of the same morpheme, and then describe how S is arranged with knife.
And the IP model, how does it see it?
The IP model describes one form changing into another as a process. So it would take knife as a basic item and describe a process that changes the F to V when the plural morpheme is added.
Like a rule for change.
Similarly, it would describe a process that changes the vowel and take to U for the past tense took, or processes that involve vowel shortening and consonant deletion to get meant from mean.
Palmer notes that linguists like Hockett pointed out, IA struggles to describe these change rules, like I turning to you.
Because I and you are phonemes, not arrangements of items. IP handles this easily by describing it as a process.
Was there debate about what process meant? Like, did it happen over time?
There was some philosophical debate about whether describing change implied the process actually happened in time, confusing synchronic, studying language at one point in time, and diachronic, studying language history.
Oh, Palmer clarifies.
But Palmer clarifies that describing synchronic change is just a metaphorical descriptive device, like saying 2 + 2 make 4. It's a statement of relation, not a description of an event unfolding over time. The IP model is generally better at capturing these more complex morphological alternations.
This shows that even describing the internal structure of words, how morphemes combine and change shape, involves intricate analysis and different theoretical approaches.
Absolutely. And these theoretical choices impact how we understand the structure. Moving beyond the shape of words themselves, grammar also deals with grammatical categories, abstract features like person, number, tense, mood, etc., that nouns, verbs, and other words carry.
And which often trigger agreement elsewhere in the sentence.
Right. And Palmer is careful to distinguish these grammatical categories from simple semantic meaning. A prime example is gender versus sex.
Okay, what's the distinction there?
In English, we distinguish sex, lexically different words for male and female animals or people, bull cow, boy girl. But we don't have grammatical gender in the same way as languages like French, Spanish, or Russian.
Where nouns have a gender.
In those languages, nouns belong to classes. Masculine, feminine, sometimes neuter, and articles and adjectives must agree in gender with the noun they modify. The choice of le or la before a noun in French or the ending of an adjective is determined by the noun's grammatical gender, not its actual sex.
So the S ending in English words like authoress or tigress isn't grammatical gender in this sense.
Palmer says no. While it distinguishes sex, it doesn't function as a grammatical gender category in English because it doesn't trigger the kind of widespread agreement seen in languages like French.
So having different words isn't enough.
Having different word forms related to sex isn't enough. Otherwise, as Palmer points out, pig and piglet would be a gender distinction. The labels we use for grammatical categories are often inherited from descriptions of languages like Latin.
Back to Latin again.
Which had grammatical gender, but not a category distinguishing adult from young, leading to potential confusion when applied to languages with different category systems.
This highlights a recurring theme. Applying labels from one language's grammar, like Latin, to another can be misleading.
Exactly. Another crucial distinction is tense versus time. We often assume verb tense maps directly onto time. Past tense for past time, present for present, future for future.
But it's not that simple, is it?
While many European languages have forms dedicated to marking these, Palmer shows English is more complex.
Like the past tense form being used for non-past or unreal time, if I knew the answer, is about a hypothetical present or future situation, not the past.
Precisely. And Palmer makes a strong claim. Morphologically speaking, English arguably has only two tenses of present form, likes, takes, and a past form, liked, took.
Only two. What about perfect or progressive?
What we traditionally call the perfect, has liked, or progressive, is liking, are actually formed using auxiliary verbs, have, be, combined with participles or gerunds, not distinct morphological tenses on the main verb itself.
So there's no distinct morphological future tense form in English?
No, not a single dedicated form like a past tense ending. We express future time using modal auxiliaries like will or shall or other constructions.
Okay, interesting.
How does Palmer explain that?